Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, it's Rick Wilson and Bill. Welcome back to the Enemies List. My guest today is Bob Bauer. Bob Bauer is one of the most experienced operatives in the Washington environment. He's been a White House counsel. He has done the work behind the scenes and in front of the scenes to make the complexities of the American democracy operate. As a former White House counsel, he knows how the White House should work and does work, and has a contrast to a lot of things in the way it has been working under the Trump era. So, but the book, folks, is terrific. It's called The Unraveling: Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis. Because, you know, Bob, I have to say that title alone, the deck of the title struck me because we really are in a sort of post-ethical political space and if we're not careful, a post-democratic political space. So
yes, I mean, I agree with that. You know, I'm struck, and I write about this in the book, by the difference between this period and Watergate. The last time we confronted an onslaught on the constitutional system. And in that time, you know, Richard Nixon and those who ran into trouble around him would embrace the very norms and institutions that they were violating. And now we see something very different. We see a frontal, explicit challenge to those norms and institutions. That's completely different. And so it makes the moment especially perilous.
So when you were White House counsel for President Obama, you ended up in a world where you had to answer some of the most consequential and complex legal questions about not only whether something that the president wanted to do was legal, but also the ramifications for the institution, the ramifications for the country. And my question in this regard is, as a White House counsel, you're one of a very select group of people. Under Trump, he wanted them to give him basically permission rather than counsel. Talk to me about that job, that role, about how it is such a consequential set of questions about and why that job is so important to the country.
Certainly. And it really does tie into this general point that I try to make in the book about how people in positions of responsibility have to be thinking about the broader context in which choices are made. I mean, that's the ethical challenge, that you're a public official in that case. By the way, the same analysis, I think, applies to people in campaigns. But in any event, in the government especially so, you have this responsibility, and you are not, for example, the lawyer for the president as an individual or the president as a candidate, or the lawyer for the president as a president.
Right.
And the relationship you have, the professional relationship you have, is to the institution of the presidency. And that was something that former President Trump clearly had enormous trouble understanding. At one point, he is said to have been charging around the building asking, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" He thought of it as a lawyer who was entirely wedded to his personal ambitions, personal preferences, personal impulses, personal designs. And that lawyer didn't and shouldn't have a wider responsibility to the American people, whose government it is, and to whom that ultimate responsibility is owed.
So as you were writing this book, I'm sure there were times you said, "Mr. President, we can't do X or Y. It's not legal, proper, or good for the institution." As you were writing this book, did you have a sense that one of the things coming at us in this election is a real decision about whether that model survives at all? Because I think that's really an important question here. Is like, do we continue to have the rule of law inside the White House? If it doesn't start there, where do people think the guardrails are going to be if you don't have it there in the White House, in the Oval with the president and the general counsel?
Yes. I mean, with the presidency we have, which is an extraordinarily empowered presidency, which is a problem in and of itself, and
For
another
sure.
source of concern to me in my other activities, um, with an empowered presidency, it is especially important that you have people whose judgment is informed by some sense of where their real responsibilities lie. Now, that isn't to say that you don't support the president, and every president is a flesh and blood individual whose
Right.
immediate political and other requirements you have to be attentive to, but you nonetheless have broad, deep, and I think immutable responsibilities to the institution of the presidency, to our constitutional form of government. And if in the White House that's missing, well, that is a source of constitutional corruption that is particularly devastating. I'll give you one example I write about in the book. John Dean's famous memo in 1971,
Mm-hmm.
before Watergate, in which he talks about how government power can be used to, quote, screw, unquote, our, quote, enemies, unquote, speaking here of enemies lists, famously assembled in the Nixon administration. And his basic view was, as White House counsel, that quite apart from his other responsibilities, he should be thinking about how government power can be used to demonize, attack, cripple the opposition.
Right.
And that's one fundamental problem we have right now, this distinguishing between the opposition, where disagreements lie, and they can be very powerful disagreements, and treating our opposition as enemies who are to be destroyed.
I mean, that is an idea that I think has slowly infused our politics, and I think it started to rise into the form it takes now, sometime around the Tea Party era, where this idea that you didn't have a disagreement with the Democrats or the Republicans. You had an existential crisis. It was all or nothing. It was the end of the world was upon us if we didn't accomplish X or Y political thing. And unfortunately, I think there's been this growth in the silos of media where people get that reinforced a lot. Is there a fix that you see on the horizon on how we can address that? Because I think that is a particularly dangerous. We used to have opposition and now we have enemies. That is, I think that it goes a lot deeper as a cause to these problems.
Yes, and it should be linked up. And I wanted to answer your question directly. It needs to be linked up to other problems. If you have enemies, and therefore they have to be destroyed, then why would you let the law get in the way? If you have enemies and they are a mortal threat to you, then why would you respect the outcome of an election that you lose? And so there are bitter fruits of that tree, of treating the opposition as your mortal enemies in an existential battle in which only one side can win. And this is where I get back to something, and some people may think it's weak tea, but I think it's critically important. It came up in a lot of the post-Watergate conversation, and that is, quite apart from reforms that we need to revive, strengthen, in some place replace with law failing norms. That gets me back to the question of an over-empowered presidency, by the way. We need individuals at every level, whether they're lawyers or not lawyers, White House counsel or senior aides to presidents, who are continuously held accountable for the individual choices they make.
Right.
Because they don't have to enable a massive lie to the American people. They don't have to, for example, assist the president in staffing the Department of Justice from top to bottom with people who will do his political bidding, irrespective of what the law is. They don't have to do those things. And some sense of ethical honor, some sense of ethical responsibility, if we lose it in public life, is not going to be the only reason our democracy deteriorates, but it is going to be a very significant reason why.
I think it'll be high up on the list if we were to look back in history. That idea that I'm just following orders, I'm just I've got a mortgage to pay sort of thing I think that is a very dark place where I knew a lot of people inside the Trump administration and the first administration who were like, I'm trying to steer the ship, but if I go too far out there and I take a stand, I lose my power. Well, the idea, folks, was to actually lose your power. If you're going to be a part of a criminal enterprise that destroys the country, maybe the power is not worth it. Maybe the power is not what you actually should be seeking in that case.
Absolutely agree. And one thing I also talk about it briefly in the book is the loss of any sense that people in that position have the option, or for that matter, people in that position who fail ethically have the option of resigning, of giving up their power,
Sure.
Of saying, I won't be part of it, or I failed in an essential mission and I accept the responsibility for it and I will leave. Now, of course, typically what we hear from people who are quitting in that respect, that's not uniformly the case, is, well, I'm leaving because the time has come for me to spend more time with my family.
Washington's greatest lie.
Yes, exactly right. I've been missing some so desperately, and now
right.
Go back. Or, even occasionally some suggestion that I've suffered so much from earning a government salary that most people in the United States can't even guess at. And therefore I have to go out in the private sector and make a fortune. That's also an explanation that's sometimes given. But how about just taking responsibility and willing to relinquish that responsibility if you can't do what is necessary, you can't do what is appropriate, or you have failed. You have evidently failed, and you have to take some responsibility for that failure.
I mean, I have long, and my government service was a long time ago, but I have long had this sense of that, and I worked for HW, so it's been forever and ever. I had very different culture, very different time, but this idea now that you haven't played by the rules, you haven't successfully achieved the mission, you haven't helped the country meaningfully, or you've hurt it meaningfully. There's so many of them now that sort of shrug it off and go, yeah, but I'm now going to go to, a pro-Trump think tank, or I'm now going to go to a lobbying firm. I'm now going to, and there's just a very big disconnect over and over again between, expectations, choices, and consequences.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is I try to be completely bipartisan, critical of a culture, rather than critical of a particular political party. And quite frankly, over the course of my career, I look back at events that I've been involved in that at the time struck me as, ones in which I played a perfectly reasonable role. And I decide, in order for this conversation to take place, we have to be somewhat honest, put our own self-criticisms on the table. And I try to do that in the book. Here's where I could have thought about things differently. It's not because I think, I engaged in Watergate-style hijinks. I didn't. But there's always room to be thinking seriously about these kinds of issues, and we do so less and less.
That is an interesting point of the intellectual honesty that is required to be an effective public servant or civil servant. I think has gotten kind of lost. There's this idea that like survival alone is the mark, or that tenure alone is the mark of success, and it's really not. There's really a sort of sense, I think, that we should probably try to recapture of doing the right thing. I mean, it's so funny we're having this conversation, and it feels almost clumsy to me about saying it because it sounds so sort of naive in the era we live in.
Well, this is one of the concerns I've had about these conversations, is that somebody will turn to me on my side, and I'm a committed Democrat, and say, we live in this era of existential threat. Trumpism is a threat to the democracy. It's also a tremendous threat to what we think government ought to do for the American public. And here you are, worrying about these sorts of issues. I mean, you're sitting around having essentially a parlor room conversation about ethics while the House is being surrounded by people with deadly weaponry. My view is, if we go down the road where this stuff doesn't matter, then we are playing on the ground that someone like Donald Trump has marked out. And that will end up badly for everybody.
I think that's exactly right. So, you mentioned earlier, and this as a conservative, my concern with the power of the executive is, traditionally that I worry that executive power can always be abused, no matter which party has too much of it or exercises it too freely or too willingly. The Supreme Court in the last few months has come down with a ruling that has essentially made the executive almost immune from a lot of the influence of consequence, What do you see like the longer running implications of the decision about Trump and immunity from the Supreme Court?
That decision is going to take some time to play out. The court, for example, found absolute immunity in some cases where the president was exercising his or her exclusive constitutional authority. But then there's also this zone of essentially presumptive immunity where maybe the president ought to be held immune. Maybe the president should not be held immune. It sort of depends on what authority the president will be exercising. Mm-hmm. And in effect, the court was equivocal about that. It's going to go to the lower courts. And so the scope of immunity that decision established is still undefined. The only thing that's off the table are purely unofficial acts for which the president is not immune. Mm-hmm. But the rest of it, I think, is not sketched out fully. But the point you make about the significance of the decision is also correct in another context, which is both sides have been willing to live with the awesome power of the presidency and to augment it as necessary, so long as it was their presidency. They complain about it when they leave, and they gladly reassert those authorities when they return to the Oval Office. And one of my projects, I wrote a book with Jack Goldsmith about this, a professor at Harvard who was in the G.W. Bush administration after Trump, that was designed to show the historical development of these potential, the collapse of guardrails around the presidency, potential exploitation of presidential power. Mm-hmm. And we made a whole sort of suggestions for reform. That conversation is urgent. Some of those reforms are under serious discussion, like curbs on presidential emergency power. Right. But we haven't taken reform of the institutional presidency seriously enough. And that is a really significant source of democratic dysfunction.
That idea, because I remember, a lot of my Republican colleagues were during the Obama administration and during the Clinton administration to a lesser degree, very much hot and bothered. Like, this is too much executive power. This is too much executive authority. He's governing as a king, all that stuff. And yet, when the shoe was on the other foot, they thought that was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a real. I think that is something we've lost as Americans, is that a willingness to be told there are limits on your power, that willingness to acknowledge that you don't get everything you want out of just winning the office. Not all of it's going to go in the direction, and not everything's going to go in the direction you feel like you deserve because of your party affiliation. But I do think that it's that abuse of executive power, though, really needs to be honestly at the top of the alarm list as we go forward.
I completely agree. I mean, Americans have this kind of split view, which is, on the one hand, they like to turn on the president savagely when things aren't going well. But on the other hand, there's also this element of hagiography that begins as soon as the president is elected. What do they eat for breakfast? What kind of pets do they like? The post-presidency, with these elaborate arrangements for libraries and post-presidential activities and the like, and their birthplaces, of course, become historic monuments. And so there's this torn, on the one hand, we want them to be accountable. On the other hand, we want them to reside in a space beyond accountability. And we expect them to perform miracles. And then we, of course, become very angry when they don't. We need a more realistic view of the presidency where it's energetic, in the words of Alexander Hamilton, and can perform critical executive function. But we also need accountability under the law and a reasonable understanding of where the presidency itself fits into the constitutional scheme. And that reasonable understanding has escaped us. And as you point out, both parties are complicit.
I mean, as a professor of mine one time said years ago at GW, it's like Federalist 51 is not a license to kill. It shaped the view of a strong executive, but it wasn't the final thing. And so I do think that as a guy who has been at the junction of law and politics, as someone who's been at the intersection of that, and I go back again, like, as a conservative, I grew up believing that the rule of law was the most fundamental underpinning of our system. That unless you had a rigid understanding that the law applies to everybody, that the constitutional operating system that we have is built to bound the power of all the different branches of government, and built to bound the power of government against things it can do to the people, that you'll end up in a very, dark place. And so you've been doing this. I've got some mileage myself, so you've been doing this for a few minutes.
Yeah.
And are you seeing the arc bending the right way or the wrong way when you look back at your whole career?
In terms of respect for the rule of law?
Yeah.
I think it comes under tremendous pressure when we have a politics in which it is thought that every contest, on the outcome of every contest, hangs the survival of everything we believe in,
Right.
the future of the republic, the future of morality. And then all of a sudden, it becomes less important to observe norms, to care about the law, to care about whether a particular presidency establishes the right constitutional legacy of respect for the rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it starts to fall away with other things like respect for elections. Frankly, also things like respect for the difference between the kind of puffery and extreme argument that you hear in politics when people are making the case for what they want on the one hand,
Right.
and on the other hand, outright absolute manipulation of voters with falsehoods, just deliberate, outright falsehoods.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because you do talk about this, about meta and some of the ideas that disinformation is one of the worst and most corrosive things that a democracy can face in this day and age.
If there is, and here, of course, this observation on my part is an original. A lot of people have made, a lot of people are disturbed by it. I talk about it from my vantage point, experiences that I've had and how I've looked at it. If you have a complete collapse of respect for not just truth, but the means by which we investigate for truth, how we look for facts that we can rely on, that we care about, that should inform public debate, then how does the rest of the democratic system survive? How do people, for example, believe what their government says? How do people believe what promises, even within the margin of puffery that we know politicians have to be given, what their politicians promise them, what they read in the newspapers, what they hear from the universities? If it's all sort of catch as catch can, it's only believable if you choose to believe it. There's no, if you will, source of fact or legitimate methodological inquiry. What happens to democratic discourse? And then what happens after democratic discourse to democratic leadership selection or democratic accountability? So it's a profound problem. We're always going to have that problem.
Right.
I mean, nobody's ever accused politicians of being wildly scrupulous about the truth. But on the other hand, there are limits. My father used to say to me, and I talk about him a little bit in the book, there are respectable limits on lying in politics. I mean, there's some room for BS, but there's also some core responsibility for not attempting to manipulate the electorate. And of course, in autocratic regimes, we see that distinction between what is true and what is not true eradicated. The idea that there's not a set of truths that we can all sort of mutually agree upon in our culture, our society, in our politics, I think is something that the era of social media, the era now of people not understanding whether something's real that they see on the internet or not, the era of deep fakes, the era of voice fakes, the era of video fakes, all of it, if you don't have all those other strong social and political infrastructure items underneath it, I think that poses a much greater risk to a democracy. They pose a risk regardless, but if you do have those other mediating institutions, I think there's a chance that you can at least have a shield against a lot of it. Yeah, no, I absolutely correct. I mean, I think that if we just, everybody can believe what they want, and we live in a world of just sort of viral confirmation bias. I only listen to people who tell me what I want to hear. I will reject, however well-founded, an argument to the contrary. Then you have essentially the functional equivalent of an intellectual civil war, and the casualties are no less serious.
Yeah, exactly. So, Bob, one more question. I want to ask you: how'd you get involved in politics? What's the origin story of your life? Because I try to like give people perspective on where folks come from and what started your journey into politics and the law?
I was born into a very political family. My father was a refugee from persecution in Europe immediately before the outbreak of the Second World War. He met my mother while fleeing. And he came to this country with this enormous admiration for what he thought were durable institutions. They don't always work the way they should. He knew that. But he cared profoundly. And I was just surrounded by political talk. So when I emerged with my law degree in 1976, I thought of various ways to use it. And one opportunity that opened itself up was politics, because we had just gone through Watergate, and the United States was embarked on the first really major regulation of the political process, in truth, in its history. And that ranged from campaign finance controls to ethics of government controls to public corruption theories that were pursued by federal prosecutors against miscreant state officials, all sorts of things like that. And then, gradually contested elections became more and more a feature many years later, and also part of the practice. So I was always thinking about, because that's also reflected in the legal choices we make about what we regulate or don't regulate in law, what kind of a political system do we have? How is it functioning? Where does it need reform? Where are the reforms failing? In some cases, I write about this in the book, I parted with my party. I've never been keen on over-regulation of money in politics.
Sure.
And that earned me some poor reviews in the reform community. In any event, that's what launched me. And part of it, just to some extent, for someone with my political interest, really good luck, because I walked out of law school right into the post-Watergate period and could use my law degree to build a practice around that.
Right. Yeah, you came in at a point where we had just had a very hard stress test of our system.
Exactly. And a stress test of our system, I talk about this in the book a little bit, where, and if I could just very briefly mention this, we talk about, the Watergate Committee and how it functioned, the courts under like Justice Sirica, who was the judge presiding over the Watergate burglars, the press and the role that it played. But there was a very interesting report that was commissioned by the Watergate Committee, the Senate Watergate Committee, for the National Academy of Public Administration. And one of the points that academy made in thinking about the roots of Watergate was that it was a collapse of abiding by the law. It was a collapse of legal compliance. But it was also a profound ethical failure among people who held public responsibility. And the roots of the legal problem were the ethical failings. And that report was published in 1974. I talk about it in the book. I think they were exactly right. It starts with the memo that is not illegal, in which you talk about screwing your enemies. Right. Goes to an enemies list, and it ends up with, for example, trying to use the IRS to punish your political opponents.
It is a very slippery slope.
Yes, it is.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Folks, the book is The Unraveling, Reflections on Politics. Excuse me. Folks, the book is The Unraveling, Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis. It is by Bob Bauer. He is a very smart guy. He is also one of the people who has been through all the ethical challenges Washington has to offer and come out on the other side standing strong. Thank you so much again, Bob, for coming on the show today, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you very much, Rick. I enjoyed it.
Thanks. Guys, the enemy today in our political system are the people in the both sides media who endlessly say, while Trump attacks blah, 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 Harris is also bad. There are not two sides of a lie, everybody. Okay? There are not two sides of a lie. And on Monday of the last week, we saw a global dip in stock markets. And what happened immediately? Stories started popping out everywhere. Do these falling markets hurt Harris? Harris to face heat on falling stock market prices. Trump given an advantage by Harris. Y'all, you know what's lacking after that little thing, that little speed bump on Monday in the global stock markets? They all went back up again. Every single goddamn one of them is back up again. As we're recording this on Friday afternoon, markets around the world are on fire again. And yet, in the 4 days since markets have started going back up again, I have not seen a wave of stories that say either rising markets help Harris in presidential bid, or will falling markets hurt Trump in presidential bid? It's so strange. It's almost as if the same goddamn song sheet that was around for Joe Biden of everything was a disaster, everything was broken, everything was wrong, and everything was bad, when it's a story about Biden versus Trump. Y'all, if you're going to play both sides, if you're going to play this game, play it with the rules you've established. Otherwise, you're going to be on the enemies list.